Hey guys, Reed at Work Turbo, and this is the first video in my series of turbo failure diagnosis. We don't like to guess at why something failed, we like to know why it failed, and they are mechanical devices, so they generally will tell a little story if you're into forensics like I am. They actually become sometimes fun. We hate to see a turbo tear up, but we like to find the problem so it won't happen again. This is one of my S480s, very common turbo that we sell. It's a T4 87 millimeter turbine with our 80 millimeter compressor, and the customer sent it in to me stating that the compressor wheel had touched off on the housing. The compressor wheel has touched off on the housing. There's a kerf on every single blade, witness marks on the inducer of every blade. Note there's no witness marks or rubbing on the exducer of any blade at all. So this is all a radial problem. So in this axis here, the thrust or axial motion this way was fine. So before I took this turbo apart, I did measure in play on the shaft in both directions, and we found that the radial direction was about 2/10 looser than when it left here. 2/10 looser would definitely correlate with the trauma of the wheel hitting the housing and the subsequent abuse the bronze bearing took. They're soft, so having a clearance opened up from the trauma of that wheel hitting the housing is not uncommon at all or unexpected. The turbine wheel has hit the housing as well. Every single blade has received the pretty close to the same amount of trauma. Why is that important? If the shaft had failed from overspeed or from imbalance issues, you would normally see a side of the wheel that's favored. So think of it as if the wheel was spinning and it was shaking and it went and hit the housing. I'm obviously exaggerating, but the vibration shook the wheel apart and caused it to hit the housing. One side of the wheel would crash really hard into the housing, while the other side would be pulled away from the housing, and everything's pretty violent when that happens. So 90% of the time I'll say that if it's a shaft failure or a bearing failure, you will have uneven blade destruction. All right, so pulled the turbo apart. The shaft looks very, very good for the trauma it's been through. No signs of heat. The piston ring is still free in the seal ring bore, so we don't have any issues with seal collapsing or excessive exhaust temperature or anything like that. The shaft has just a little polished area where the bearings were riding, but no material swapping, so lubrication was good. The bearings show what I would expect them to, the exact same condition as the shaft wheel and the bearing housing. So we had, through our blueprint records, we had good bearing clearances and can kind of sign off on this not being an issue. Moving on to the axial side of things, the thrust collar and thrust washer are both in really good condition, no signs of heat nor any type of trauma. Thrust bearing shows the same. You can still see the tooling marks on the ramps of the thrust bearing where they were machined, and on the thrust loaded side, apologize, got a little flash rust on it where I ran it through the little bit of the cleaner. Actually, that's just oil residue. Anyhow, the bearing is great. It's exactly the same clearance as when it left here. So if the bearings look good, the wheel has trauma on both, compressor and turbine equally around both sides. The next step we would go to is doing a quick mic of the compressor housing bore. This is a race application, so I do set those up a tad bit looser just to allow for the abuse these things take. And the bore is when I say spot on, it is within a 10,000th of the correct bore. The exhaust housing was machined from Borg Warner. I did double check it for proper bore diameter and being concentric with the center line of the bearing housing register. So everything was good there. So I started digging a little bit closer. The compressor housing shows very, very little trauma. The wheel is touched off on the housing, but it has not left any witnesses behind other than just a faint line all the way around where it's touched pretty much everywhere on the housing ever so slightly. However, when we get to the exhaust housing, it's a different story. Right here we have all of the turbine wheel inconel that basically got rubbed off that wheel and tried to weld itself to this exhaust housing. As we spin the exhaust housing around, we have no other witness marks anywhere in the housing. This is very important to me because for that to happen, the bore of this housing would have to be off center. This machine work would have to be off axis, or this machine work would have to be off center or off axis. I am going to check this once I clean it, but something else caught my eye immediately when I disassembled it, so I don't know if y'all can catch it yet. So when we coat these housings, it's a very thin coating, but it's fairly durable. It's worn off right here. Worn off pretty good right here. This housing has been through the ultrasonic cleaner so we could get all the soot and stuff out of it. It's a diesel application. Anyway, the coating is in still really good shape here, but it is missing right here. And you know, this coating's not, you can scratch it off, but it's not super easy to scratch off. We go over here to the bearing housing, and we have the same witness mark here. And as you go around where the mounting flange is, we have soot, a lot of soot. So immediately when I saw this, red flag went up that the turbo was not, either the V-band was not tight or it was not registered into its bore correctly. What that did was when this side was tight and this side was loose, it rocked the whole bearing housing towards us, which pushed the tail of the turbine wheel, or the exducer of the turbine wheel, away from us. And that is exactly in line with that witness mark right there on the housing. Pretty hard evidence, and that is the case. I am, like I said, going to check this bearing housing and turbine housing. These are OE Borg-Warner parts, and we have very, very few problems out of their quality. They have some of the highest quality machine work I have been privileged to work with in my career. So we'll check it just to make sure that there is not a problem with this flange being flat, or, well, I've already checked this one. This one is flat, this one is on center, and the bore is correct. So leaves us just the bearing housing being the potential culprit for failure outside of the clamp being loose or the housing not being registered into the bore tightly before the clamp was secured. You know, we hate to see turbo failures. I think I've already said that, but you know, they are mechanical parts, and while they look very simple, they have to be for the environment they live in. They are very precise, very complicated, and when they do have issues, we sometimes get lucky enough to where they don't just completely come apart, and we can do this forensic research, as I like to call it, or my wife really likes to call it, and see what has caused this problem. But let's see, what do I want to end with? Oh, why did the compressor wheel hit the housing if the turbine side was the problem? Well, once the turbine wheel touched off, it does throw everything out of balance. And when I say out of balance, not like balance in it's shaking and then just started shaking itself apart, but think of it more as an oscillation or a spring, because this is a shaft, and obviously there's going to be some deflection in the shaft. So when this side of the wheel started hitting the housing and shaking, the other end did this as well. And because the problem did not lie just in the compressor wheel being completely out of balance on one side, or failure in material there, or bad machine work, as it oscillated in and out of the the shaft oscillated or sprung, the wheel, would have touched off as it rotated pretty evenly around. I'm going to measure it. I will probably find one or two blades that have more material taken off than the other, just because of that action, but it's very small. The thrust bearing not having any failure obviously is the reason why there's no problems with the exducer of either wheel touching off at all. It's all just right on the tips of the exducer, so, and exactly in line with that witness mark in the housing. Yep. If y'all guys like content like this, let me know. Drop me a comment below. Got any questions? I'll be happy to try to answer them, but maybe I can do some more of these videos and help share some of the things we see, both good and bad, because, hey, we're all only human beings and stuff tears up from time to time. But guys, I appreciate you watching. Do all the things YouTube wants you to do, and thanks for tuning in. Y'all have a good day.